The Western Front of World War II was a crucible of constant innovation and brutal learning for all involved armies. The night, however, offered a temporary sanctuary, a shift in the balance of power, and often a dangerous reprieve from daylight aerial supremacy. German forces, seasoned veterans of the war's initial campaigns, developed a profound confidence in their ability to dominate the hours of darkness. Their doctrine emphasized well-drilled defense, coordinated artillery fire, and effective use of flares and searchlights to illuminate any perceived threat. This proficiency bred a dangerous complacency, particularly when observing the early attempts of their American counterparts to engage after dusk. For many high-ranking German officers, the American approach to night fighting seemed amateurish, clumsy, and predictable in its movements. They saw soldiers who were overly reliant on vehicular lights, who made too much noise, and who failed to grasp the psychological dimensions of true darkness warfare. Reports from the front lines often contained dismissive remarks, detailing how easy it was to anticipate and repel American nighttime probes and patrols. The captured intelligence revealed a profound disdain for the perceived lack of discipline and the failure to maintain true blackout conditions in forward operating areas. This derision was not merely propaganda, it was a deeply held tactical belief rooted in early battlefield experience against a less experienced foe. The Americans, they felt, approached the night as an obstacle to be overcome with noise and light, rather than a weapon to be wielded with silence and stealth. This sense of superiority created a massive blind spot within the German command structure, fostering an overconfidence that would eventually prove catastrophic. They failed to account for the American capacity to adapt, to absorb hard lessons, and to fundamentally rethink their entire operational philosophy under the cloak of night. This mockery, echoed in officer mess halls and frontline diaries, set the stage for one of the most shocking tactical reversals of the European campaign. The very darkness they claimed to own would soon be turned against them by an enemy they had profoundly underestimated in the shadows. The initial American foray into sustained combat demonstrated significant growing pains, particularly when the sun went down. American military doctrine had historically placed less emphasis on night combat, treating it more as a period for rest, resupply, and limited, defensive action. The training reflected this bias, often failing to instill the requisite discipline and skill for effective movement and engagement in absolute darkness. Early in the war, American units frequently struggled with basic elements of night navigation, leading to misplaced units and logistical confusion. A pervasive fear of friendly fire made commanders hesitant to fully utilize supporting artillery, further hamstringing offensive capabilities after sunset. The reliance on artificial light, even small flashlights or vehicle lamps, was a major tactical flaw immediately exploited by the vigilant German defenders. These visible beacons offered German spotters easy targets and clear indicators of American troop concentrations or movement axes. German machine gunners often waited patiently for a flare to be fired or a light to flicker before unleashing devastating, accurate barrages into the exposed formations. The sound discipline was equally poor, with soldiers unintentionally betraying their positions through loud equipment, talking, or poorly muffled engine noise. Combat reports from the front lines in Tunisia and early Italy painted a grim picture of American units suffering disproportionate losses during nighttime operations. These failures were not due to a lack of courage, but rather a fundamental disconnect between pre-war training and the harsh realities of facing a professional, experienced foe. The cumulative effect was a self-fulfilling prophecy, where initial failures reinforced the German belief in their nocturnal dominance. This period of tactical weakness necessitated a complete overhaul of the U.S. Army's approach, a hard reckoning with the demands of total war. The grim casualty figures provided a compelling, unavoidable mandate for change, demanding that the American soldier become as effective in the pitch black as he was in the daylight. It was a crucial, painful lesson that American military leadership had to learn quickly if they intended to maintain the initiative on the ground. The German army's tactical superiority in night combat was not accidental. It was a product of extensive pre-war planning and continuous battlefield refinement. From the very start of the Blitzkrieg, German forces were adept at utilizing the cover of darkness for both maneuver and defensive fortification. Their non-commissioned officer corps, a backbone of tactical knowledge, was specifically trained to manage complex operations without relying on visible light sources. German defensive lines were meticulously planned to integrate natural obstacles with strategically placed fields of fire, ensuring maximum lethality under any conditions. They expertly used acoustic and thermal detection methods long before their opponents, granting them an invaluable early warning advantage. The systematic use of trip flares and pre-registered defensive artillery barrages made any unsanctioned movement across no man's land a near-suicidal proposition. This mastery instilled a psychological edge. German soldiers felt secure under the cover of night, while the Americans felt exposed and vulnerable. This ingrained confidence manifested in the mocking tone of German intelligence summaries and post-battle reports concerning U.S. operations. They believed the Americans lacked the necessary soldierly grit, the organizational discipline, and the deep tactical understanding to pose a serious threat after sundown. The German command assumed that their defensive superiority at night was a permanent, immutable feature of the conflict. This assumption led to strategic overconfidence, causing them to allocate fewer resources and less attention to counter-night attack training. Their forward-deployed units began to relax their guard slightly, convinced that any large-scale attack would only be launched at first light. This tactical hubris, born of historical success, ironically created the very conditions necessary for the American turnaround to succeed. The predictable nature of the German defense, established by their own overweening certainty, became the fatal flaw that American planners would ruthlessly exploit. They could not conceive of an enemy capable of moving with such absolute silence and coordination through the same darkness they considered their own impregnable domain. The established American night fighting doctrine was fundamentally a carryover from earlier, less pressurized conflicts and a general lack of experience. The military, focused on overwhelming firepower and logistical might, initially struggled to adapt to the nuanced requirements of stealth warfare. Operational commanders often insisted on visible markers, lights for vehicle convoys, and audible communications for maintaining control. This reliance on sensory cues was deeply problematic in an environment where the enemy was hypervigilant and expertly concealed. For example, the sound of a convoy halting for a resupply could be heard for miles, giving the German high command hours of warning about upcoming operations. The use of star shells, while sometimes necessary, often served to silhouette the very troops they were meant to support, turning them into easy targets. A simple mistake, like a soldier lighting a cigarette or failing to properly cover a slit trench, could reveal an entire unit's position. This created a vicious cycle where the fear of the dark led to an over-reliance on light, which in turn increased vulnerability and casualties. The doctrine prioritized administrative ease and control over tactical survival and surprise, a trade-off that cost many lives in the initial campaigns. This systemic issue was not merely the fault of individual soldiers but a failure of institutional training to evolve with the demands of the European theater. The Germans, operating with strict radio silence and minimal movement, were a ghostly presence compared to the often lumbering American approach. The difference was one of philosophy. The German saw the night as a shield, while the American treated it like an inconvenient blackout requiring emergency lighting. Realizing the futility of this approach was the first, most difficult step toward implementing the radical changes that would eventually redefine their combat effectiveness. The American army had to shed its ingrained habits and embrace an entirely new, counterintuitive philosophy of operational silence and unseen movement. The turning point was driven by the sobering reality of the casualty figures and the tireless dedication of forward-thinking military reformers. Senior staff, particularly those serving under generals who valued innovation and rapid adaptation, began to demand a fundamental strategic shift. They recognized that winning the war required not just overwhelming force, but also a mastery of the tactical subtleties of the battlefield. A systematic analysis of German night operations and American failures revealed a clear pattern. The US was beaten by doctrine, not necessarily by superior individual soldier skill. This analysis led to the creation of specialized training cadres and a complete rewrite of the field manuals concerning night operations. The new emphasis was placed on absolute sound and light discipline, utilizing the deepest darkness as the most effective form of cover. The concept of blacked-out infantry was formalized, mandating the removal of anything that could reflect light, from buttons to rifle barrels. New specialized equipment, though often rudimentary, was quickly developed and deployed to aid in silent movement and navigation, such as non-reflective compasses and blackout maps. Crucially, the new training was led by veterans who had learned the hard lessons firsthand, lending the program instant credibility and urgency. The reformers understood that doctrine alone was insufficient. They needed to change the very mindset of the average American infantryman. They instilled the idea that the night was not a period of vulnerability, but an offensive opportunity to bypass fortified positions and strike at the enemy's soft underbelly. This genesis of change represented a major institutional shift, transforming the American military from a daylight-only force into a truly 24-hour fighting machine. It was a testament to the Army's ability to adapt under pressure, a necessary evolution driven by the high price of earlier tactical errors. The new approach was not just about stealth, it was about creating a new kind of terror for the enemy, the fear of the unseen, silent attack. The blacked-out infantry soldier was the ultimate expression of the American Army's renewed commitment to night warfare. Every piece of gear was scrutinized, painted, or covered to eliminate any possibility of a reflection, a crucial detail often overlooked before. Faces were covered in dark camouflage cream, a necessary measure to prevent pale skin from glowing under the faint ambient light. Movement was practiced meticulously, emphasizing a slow, deliberate pace that minimized noise from crushing leaves or dislodging loose gravel. Rifle slings were tightly taped down, bayonets sheathed, and canteens secured to prevent the slightest telltale metallic rattle. The soldiers were trained to rely on their other senses, navigating by the feel of the terrain underfoot and the subtle sounds of the natural environment. A new emphasis was placed on communicating through silent hand signals, replacing the radio chatter and shouted commands of earlier operations. They learned to use the terrain as a genuine shield, moving along depressions, tree lines, and shadow edges rather than across open ground. This training was grueling, conducted under conditions of absolute sensory deprivation to force a complete reliance on discipline and teamwork. The goal was to make the American infantryman an invisible, intangible threat, indistinguishable from the shadows of the night. This transformation was more than tactical, it was psychological, imbuing the soldiers with the confidence that they could operate in the dark as effectively as their German opponents. The success of the blacked-out soldier relied entirely on trust in their training, and trust in the absolute discipline of the man next to them. They became masters of the silent penetration, designed to move through gaps and weak points in the German line undetected before exploding into violence in the heart of the enemy position. This new breed of night fighter would soon deliver a devastating reality check to the overconfident German command that had once scorned their abilities. The establishment of specialized night fighting schools marked a decisive break from the old, ineffective training regimen. These courses focused on practical, hands-on application rather than classroom theory, simulating the confusion and terror of actual combat. Trainees were subjected to extended periods in pitch darkness, forced to perform complex tasks like assembling weapons and treating simulated wounds by touch alone. A core component was a confidence training, aimed at overcoming the natural human fear and disorientation associated with total darkness. Instructors relentlessly enforced sound and light discipline, using harsh, immediate penalties for any breach, thereby making stealth second nature. The curriculum included advanced instruction in star navigation, silent reconnaissance techniques, and the effective use of non-visible signaling methods. Crucially, the new mindset encouraged small unit initiative, empowering junior officers and NCOs to make rapid, silent decisions without seeking centralized command approval. This decentralization of command was diametrically opposed to the rigid German style and proved invaluable during the chaos of a night engagement. The training emphasized the element of surprise as the primary weapon, turning the dark into an offensive asset rather than a defensive liability. Soldiers were taught that a successful night attack was not about overwhelming force but about paralyzing the enemy's ability to react. This intensive, psychologically demanding program forged a core of infantrymen who were not merely surviving the night but actively exploiting it. The psychological victory over the darkness translated into a tactical superiority that the Germans had not anticipated and were not prepared to counter. The effectiveness of this new training quickly spread through the ranks, transforming the American reputation from clumsy night movers to silent, deadly phantoms. This cultural shift within the infantry was perhaps the most enduring and important development of the entire overhaul process. The new doctrine and training regime awaited their validation in the unforgiving laboratory of the battlefield. The early application of the blacked-out infantry concept was deployed in highly localized, often limited objective operations designed to test and refine the new skills. These initial probes were not massive assaults, but surgical, silent penetrations aimed at disrupting German communications and sowing confusion behind the lines. Units were tasked with bypassing the main German strongpoints, utilizing dense woods and neglected sectors of the front to gain entry. The meticulous discipline of the new soldiers proved immediately effective, as patrols began to successfully infiltrate positions previously considered impenetrable. German wire obstacles, which had once been deadly barriers, were now silently cut and traversed without alerting the nearby sentries. The success reports detailed the incredible surprise achieved by the American soldiers, who often found German troops resting or performing routine tasks with a false sense of security. In one notable early action, a small blacked-out company managed to traverse several miles of no-man's land and destroy a key German command post, retreating before dawn without a single casualty. The psychological impact on the German defenders was immense, leading to panicked reports of phantom troops operating within their own lines. The German officers, still clinging to their old assumptions, initially dismissed these incidents as isolated acts of desperation or exaggerated reports from nervous troops. However, the regularity and success of these silent attacks began to suggest a deeper, more systemic change in American capability. The first true test had proven the concept, discipline and stealth could effectively negate the German superior nighttime defense systems. This period of successful infiltration provided the American High Command with the confidence to plan a much larger, more ambitious operation utilizing the new doctrine. The stage was now set for the blacked-out infantry to deliver a decisive, large-scale shock to the German front. The culmination of the new doctrine was an offensive that relied entirely on the silent penetration of the German forward defenses. The American plan called for multiple waves of blacked-out infantry to infiltrate deep behind the front, bypassing the heavily fortified main line of resistance. These spearhead units were tasked with creating confusion, neutralizing local command centers, and most importantly, securing the flanks for a follow-on assault. The night of the attack was chosen for its moonless, overcast conditions, maximizing the cover of absolute darkness. Moving with a silence and coordination that was unimaginable months earlier, the American infantry melted into the shadows and passed through the German lines. The German sentries, operating on the assumption that any large-scale attack would be noisy and easily visible, were completely unaware of the developing crisis. When the silent Americans reached their objectives, the fighting erupted suddenly and violently, a shock that paralyzed the defenders. German units, hit from the rear and the flank by unseen enemies, struggled to determine the size and location of the attacking force. The lack of effective night counterattack training meant that the German response was slow, disorganized, and often directed at the wrong sectors. The element of surprise was a weapon far more devastating than any artillery barrage, shattering the cohesion of entire German battalions. Radio communications in the German rear quickly broke down into panicked, confused reports of mass infiltration and command post overruns. The once mocked American soldier had become a silent, terrifying assassin, using the very darkness the Germans had relied upon as their armor. This single night of successful, widespread penetration entirely discredited the German officers' prior beliefs about American battlefield competence. The tactical shockwave created an immediate and unmanageable breach in the front that the main follow-on forces could now exploit. The success of the blacked-out infantry's penetration created a crucial, wide-open gap in the German defensive structure. This breach, achieved with minimal casualties to the attacking American units, allowed the main force to commit to the offensive at first light. American armor and mechanized infantry, which had been held in reserve, quickly surged forward through the newly opened corridor. The exploitation phase of the battle was characterized by speed and overwhelming firepower, further compounding the chaos in the German rear. German commanders, having lost their forward observation posts and communications, struggled desperately to organize a cohesive counterattack. The absence of a solid, continuous front line meant that entire sectors of the German defense were now isolated and vulnerable to encirclement. The psychological damage was profound. Troops who felt secure in their prepared positions now found themselves fighting a desperate, rearguard action. The strategic consequences of the successful night penetration were immediate and far-reaching, accelerating the entire campaign timeline. It demonstrated that the American army had not just matched the Germans in night fighting, but had, in this instance, surpassed them with a superior, adaptive doctrine. The battle became a textbook example of how a psychological and tactical advantage, once gained, can be rapidly converted into a massive operational success. The daylight revealed the full extent of the German disarray, with abandoned equipment and disorganized retreat marking the path of the American advance. The mocked, clumsy American infantry had delivered a crippling blow that few in the German high command could have ever predicted. This exploitation was the moment where the strategic initiative decisively swung away from the veteran German forces in that sector. The breakthrough heralded a new phase of the war where the hours of darkness were no longer a guaranteed sanctuary for the defenders. The morning after the successful night attack was a period of grim, painful reckoning for the German high command. The depth and speed of the American penetration forced a complete and embarrassing reassessment of their tactical assumptions. Captured German officers, some of whom had personally signed reports mocking the Americans, were visibly stunned by the turn of events. Their interrogation revealed a genuine shock that the enemy had been capable of such silent, disciplined, and coordinated movement in the dark. The previously held belief in the American soldiers' lack of discipline was shattered by the undeniable evidence of their systematic success. Intelligence reports now urgently cautioned that the American army was no longer the predictable, daylight-centric force of earlier campaigns. Commanders were forced to acknowledge that their own hubris had led to a fatal underestimation of the enemy's capacity for rapid, fundamental adaptation. Orders were immediately issued to revamp German night fighting training, but the time and resources needed for such an overhaul were scarce. The psychological security blanket of the night had been violently torn away, leaving the German soldier feeling perpetually exposed and vulnerable. This sudden loss of tactical confidence complicated every aspect of their defensive planning and resource allocation for the subsequent weeks. The German army had to concede that their opponents were not only proficient fighters but also fast learners who could weaponize a deficiency. The shift in perspective was complete, mockery was replaced by grudging respect, and then by a deep, operational fear of the silent night attack. The lesson was brutal but clear: in modern warfare, no perceived advantage is permanent, especially when facing a determined and adaptive opponent. The shock served as a painful reminder of the war's dynamic nature and the catastrophic cost of strategic complacency. The successful night penetrations of World War II left an indelible mark on American military doctrine that persists to this day. The concept of the blacked-out infantry was refined and expanded, becoming a foundational principle of modern special operations and conventional forces alike. The lessons learned about sound discipline, light control, and small unit stealth are now cornerstones of contemporary tactical training. The war demonstrated that technological superiority is often less decisive than disciplined movement and the effective use of natural cover. The story serves as a powerful historical narrative about the necessity of humility and constant self-assessment in military strategy. It is a timeless reminder that armies must adapt to the conditions of the current conflict, not cling to the successes of the past. The image of the silent American soldier, moving like a shadow through the German lines, represents a crucial moment of tactical evolution. This profound change allowed the American army to fight and win decisively in a 24-hour operational cycle, maintaining relentless pressure on the enemy. The legacy is evident in the advanced night vision and thermal optics used by modern soldiers, all extensions of the basic principle of owning the dark. The initial German mockery unintentionally spurred the very innovation that led to their eventual defeat in those crucial early morning hours. The blacked-out infantry became a symbol of American resilience, transforming a liability into a formidable, war-winning capability. This episode remains a powerful illustration of how the psychological edge, once ceded, can be violently reclaimed through disciplined, focused training. The shadows of the European night ultimately concealed a strategic shift that helped hasten the end of the conflict in the Western theater.